Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Stephanie Leiter, and I am the director of the Mexico Security Initiative at the Robert Strauss Center. For those of you who do not know what the Mexico Security Initiative is, we aim to provide policy-relevant scholarship on a range of issues. Can you hear me in the back? I'll speak a little louder. So we focus, as our name might suggest, mostly on public security and violence in Mexico, but we also do some research on other issues such as Central American migration and the U.S.-Mexico border. We have been very fortunate for the past few months to be working with two Brumley fellows, John and Courtney, and I'll talk in a second about what they've been working on. But to take one moment, the Brumley program takes students from around the University of Texas and pairs them with faculty and scholars at the Strauss Department so that they can develop their own independent research projects over the fall and spring semesters. So in that vein, John has been working on a project related to obstacles to implementing Mexico's judicial reform, and Courtney has been doing research on Mexican and U.S. immigration policy, specifically focused on aspects of deterrence. So I'm now going to hand it over to the two of them, who will introduce our guest speaker for today, Ben Rohrbaugh, for his very timely talk on the U.S.-Mexico border.
Thank you for the introduction, Stephanie. It's a privilege to be able to help introduce someone as accomplished as Ben Rohrbaugh here today. We could spend all day talking about his life story and the things he's done, but in the interest of time, so we have more time for questions after the fact, I'll keep it very brief. In addition to his role as a principal at Border Works Advisory, Ben also is an associate with the Belfer Center Homeland Security Project at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he provides expertise on U.S.-Mexico relations and border security, among other issues. He earned his degree in political science and history from the University of California, Davis. Prior to government service, Ben worked on different political campaigns, including Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. And I'll let Courtney talk a little bit more about what he's done recently.
Sure, thanks, John. So Ben served as the Director of Enforcement and Border Security at the National Security Council in the White House from 2014 to 2016. In this capacity, he was responsible for border management with both Mexico and Canada, and developed a new council prioritizing border infrastructure investments. And Ben was most recently a senior advisor in the Department of Homeland Security. He currently serves as a principal at Border Works Advisors, LLC, a law firm specializing in border management consultation services. We're very lucky to have him here today with us, so please help me in welcoming Ben Rohrbaugh.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the generous introduction. My name is Ben Rohrbaugh, and I began the interview process at the National Security Council in the summer of 2014. And it went very quickly, which was unusual. I'd gone through a couple previous interview processes where I hadn't been selected for jobs, and each time they have this sort of like skull and bonesy recruitment process where someone comes and talks to you and says that someone else might want to talk to you, and then eventually you go in and talk to other people, and you don't know if they're interested, and then after a while you find out from someone else that they hired a different person. And that was very much not the case this time. Suddenly everything went really quickly. They wanted me to come in 2 days later to meet the person who'd be my boss, and then suddenly I'm in front of the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, and then suddenly I'm being onboarded and starting this new job. And so at the time, I interpreted that by thinking, aha, my gifts are finally being recognized. These people have realized what they're missing out on, the previous 3 times, and now they realize that what the White House really needed is Ben Rohrbaugh doing border security. And I arrived and very quickly realized that wasn't actually the case, and that wasn't actually why my predecessor was smiling so much. I'd been accustomed to border protection, and sort of for the backdrop on this was the summer when Central American migration first reached a crisis level, where it first overwhelmed the organization of the United States government at the border. And you had about, it was a little under 70,000 unaccompanied children and 70,000 family groups arriving in these very vulnerable populations and being put in situations where the government wasn't ready to deal with populations like that. You had images of border patrol stations overflowing with children, and if anyone here has spent time and been in a border patrol station, they're not appropriate places for children at all, really. And so you had this crisis going on, but I dealt with it at Customs and Border Protection, but I didn't quite realize what was happening at the White House. So I arrived for my first week and then found out. And when you're a director at the National Security Council, your job is sort of peaks and valleys where you'll have a few event-driven times when everything is crazy. And normally there'll be a foreign visit, or you'll have really senior meetings, a meeting of the deputy secretaries that you're staffing on your issue, or you'll need to do a memo on something to the president for a decision. And that'll happen maybe a half dozen times in the year you're there, per year while you're there. And I got to do half of those things my first week. It was just bonkers. We arrived and I had to staff a deputies committee that Thursday, but before that we had an internal meeting where the domestic policy advisor is mad at everyone because they haven't made any progress, and same with the White House deputy chief of staff, and everyone is, it's just a ton of things happening. And at the end of the week, after the deputies committee, we had to do a memo to the president because, of course, he at that time was getting a memo every 2 weeks. And so I finally, this week ended, and my predecessor was sitting there again with a big smile on his face. And I said, what a crazy week. And he just sort of patted me on the shoulder and was like, this portfolio is always like that. I've got to go to my farewell and then into the sunset. And so that was 2014, and here we are. It's 5 years later, and somehow the situation on the border is actually worse. We were going crazy. You had the entire White House going nuts because there were going to be 70,000 members of families arriving at the border, and we didn't have capacity to deal with them. And now there's 30,000 arriving in a month. And so how is it? This is right now, we're looking at the largest total number of apprehensions that have happened in more than a decade. And these are unique individuals, which didn't used to be the case. How after this much time has the situation not improved? We had the entire White House focused on it in 2014, and they continued focusing on it afterwards, and then there was a presidential election that focused on migration to an unprecedented level. And now we're in a place where the president just this week fired everyone at the Department of Homeland Security. And so what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is sort of how we got here. How we've ended up in this situation where we have an ongoing crisis at the border. I'm going to talk about, my argument here is going to be that the core of this is that we've built a border, we've both physically built a border, and we've built a border security enterprise to do certain things, and what is happening now at the border and what the enterprise at the border is dealing with are very different. So we built a border for one thing, and now it has to do something different. I'm going to talk about sort of why the government hasn't been able to fix this, and my argument here is that this is an issue that falls in between lots of different agencies. There are a lot of different agencies involved, but the one thing that is completely consistent is that for every agency, it's something they don't want to do. It is something that they don't see themselves as wanting, it's something that they don't see as their mission, and it's something that they really wish some other agency would deal with. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of part of how we got here, what the policy process was like in the Obama administration, which I was very much a part of. And what my argument here will be is that the Obama administration had very robust systems in place to make decisions, but they started to use them to manage processes. And that what happened is that this problem was basically managed by committees, managed by regular meetings, which is not a great way to organize when you're faced with an urgent crisis. And the result, and a lot of this was driven by the administration having other migration priorities at the time through the executive orders. The result was that the government turned to the government of Mexico, and the government of Mexico were seen as really, the government of Mexico ramped up their enforcement and really alleviated the problem for the United States government. And then finally, sort of is how we got here, I'll talk a little bit about the Trump administration and what that decision-making has looked like and what sort of the consequences are of having policy decisions made outside of a rigorous policy process, and how you end up with the kind of things that we've seen, the shutdown, the threats to close the border, firing everybody at the Department of Homeland Security, and some of the other things that have happened. So just to begin sort of with how we got here, how we've ended up in this space. The border, historically, the border enterprise was sort of built for for two different things, sort of in terms of migration and then in terms of the physical infrastructure. Migration historically on the border obviously has been largely migration by Mexican nationals. Much of it seasonal, much of it driven by economic reasons and seasonal work. And so historically, people would move back and forth across the border relatively frequently, much more frequently than they do now. And the initial reaction to that, the initial buildup in the border security enterprise was in response to seasonal migration and perceived rule of law issues at the border. It was images of thousands of people getting ready to run across the border from Tijuana across the Ozai Mesa, or trucks driving across in Yuma, Arizona. These are the sort of images that led to a lot of the buildup that began in the early 90s. And so, in response to that, the U.S. government put a lot more resources into staffing at the border, a lot more resources into technology, and put a lot more resources into physical barriers. So the Border Patrol doubled in size twice since the 90s. It doubled between 1992 and 1998. It went from about 4,000 to about 8,000. And then again in the early 2000s, from 2004 to 2009, it went from about 10,000 to about 20,000, which is close to where it is now. And almost all of that's on the southwest border, 18,000 or so. Are there. So you had a huge increase in the population of Border Patrol agents who are then there to stop migration between the ports. You had, through the Secure Fence Act, fencing put up in most of the urban areas on the border, places like El Paso Juarez or San Diego Tijuana, Nogales, suddenly places where urban areas did not used to have the kind of physical barriers have huge fencing that make it much more difficult to cross. And you've had a huge increase in the amount of technology that's gone into border security. The most dramatic example of this is actually a failed program, the Secure Border Initiative, or Secure Border Network, which was done during the Bush administration, which was the virtual wall, which is sort of a textbook case. If any of you are interested in government mismanagement of contracts, there are some scathing GAO reports you can look at. But after wasting several $1 billion on that, the government continued to invest much more and brought in things like aerial drones that had been originally designed by the Department of Defense and tethered aerostats and vehicle-mounted video systems and sensors and all sorts of other things that really improved their ability to identify when people were crossing. And so the initial problem that the Border Patrol was designed to address, which was seasonal Mexican migration and sort of rule of law at the border, has largely been changed. From the high water mark in 2000, where there were about 1.6 million apprehensions, almost entirely of Mexican nationals crossing the border. By 2016, for Mexican migration, that had been reduced over 90%. Migration is no longer seasonal. It is difficult enough to cross now that you need to hire guides, you need to pay money. It's a fundamentally different kind of movement back and forth across the border. And so the specific thing that we built our border security enterprise to do now has, to a large extent, been done. And what's happening is we're faced with something totally different. The other big change has been that the ports themselves, where goods and people are legally processed to move back and forth across the border, are all very old. Most of these were built at a time when economic interactions between Mexico and the United States were much lower than they are now, most 40 years ago. Both NAFTA, since which exports to Mexico have increased 5-fold and imports from Mexico have increased 6-fold. And then 9/11 security requirements, where suddenly we're taking a much closer look at the people who are crossing at those ports, have strained the ports so that it's now much, much harder. There's much more people, much more goods trying to move through, but much less ability to do longer kinds of processing. And so those two things then have been challenged by a shift in migration. And this is sort of the core of my argument that what we built the border for is not what's happening. Or now, the migrants who are arriving, the people who are being apprehended crossing the border, are largely Central American. Many vulnerable populations, either families with children or just unaccompanied children themselves, and they're claiming humanitarian protections when they arrive. This is fundamentally different than whatever's happened before. These people have rights to actually make asylum claims once they arrive. The processing of them, because of these vulnerable populations, is much more complicated. You know, they're not, it's not like a single adult where they're detained at a border patrol station and then go into ICE detention or something. I mean, these are people who have to be treated in certain ways. And so what's happened is that the infrastructure that's been built, which is designed to remove single adults who are coming into the United States for work reasons, for economic reasons, has to do something totally different, and it's not structured for that. So this is sort of the reason that this challenge causes so much stress for the U.S. government. But then you think, well, okay, but that, you know, this crisis first came to light in 2014. It was visible to people in 2013. We've known for a while that there was going to be a shift into sort of human smuggling kind of trafficking. Why hasn't the U.S. government been able to adapt? Why haven't we dealt with this and changed things and fixed the problem? So this gets to the point that there are a lot of agencies involved in this. There are a lot of agencies that feel pain from this, but that are not the lead. And none of them see this. None of them see this kind of challenge as their core mission. And that's what is sort of makes it so difficult and makes it so hard for the government to adapt. So, you know, when agencies in the United States government and any government they have a certain worldview. They have a certain understanding of what they do. They train people. Their staffs do certain things, and it's very difficult for them to adapt to being required to do things that are sort of outside of what they believe their mission to be. Particularly sort of amplifying that, it's even harder for them to give up a strategy that has been successful in the past. Once someone in government has been successful at something, once an agency has been successful, they want to do it forever. As a side note, if you ever are in meetings where you interact with people from the CIA or DEA who have worked in Latin America, it takes 20 seconds before they start talking about the triumphs of Plan Colombia. This is something that worked really well for them, and it's just like they're going to bring it up no matter what you're talking about. And this, so for a lot of these agencies, Border Patrol, they've been very successful at stopping seasonal migration, but now they're doing something totally different. So for Border Patrol, now they see themselves as people who go out and apprehend people who are trying to cross illegally, who are trying to evade apprehension. That's what they're there for, the sort of rule of law at the border. But now migrants are crossing and turning themselves into Border Patrol, saying, please, come take me, and I want to go into the asylum queue, which is just fundamentally not what Border Patrol sees their job as. For ICE, ICE has strict limits on whether they're not allowed to detain children at all. They can only detain families for a short amount of time. Like, ICE gets beat up a lot, but they are responsive to public pressure and media pressure. They would rather not be the agency detaining and removing families. They would rather be the agency detaining dangerous criminals, removing dangerous criminals. But at the same time, if they are going to hold people, they don't want to just release them. They want to actually go through a process, and they want people to actually, go through a court process, and if they need to be removed, they be removed. And so now ICE is in a situation where they're holding people for a very short amount of time and then dropping them off at bus stations or something so they can go into the immigration court process, which is fundamentally not what they see themselves as doing. Health and Human Services, which is the agency that actually places unaccompanied children after they've arrived and gone through Border Patrol processing. Their Office of Refugees and Resettlement is designed and it's staffed with people who want to help resettle foreign refugees. If someone is a victim of a war, moves to Tulsa, and HHS helps move them, help them integrate in the local community, like that's the sort of thing they do. They're not used to or good at running large facilities for mass migrations. That's not something that they have done before, and so it's very challenging for them. We would have, when I was working in the White House on these issues, Health and Human Services would constantly be trying to find new facilities just in case their existing facilities got overrun. And the process was just a rolling disaster, where they always were trying to do a military base and that wouldn't work, and they'd find some other space. And so we had this whole sequence over Christmas 2015, where we announced, literally Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, all of these new sites, and then had to draw them all back because they were totally inappropriate for children. One of them literally had a problem with alligators and bears on the site, and another one was adjacent to a firing range, which is obviously not good places to house children. And so after spending all of Christmas and keeping everyone working, we had to then go back and watch them all melt down as we told them that it wasn't going to work. Anyway, I'm not saying this to call them incompetent. It's just not what they do. And then the immigration courts are wildly backed up. Immigration judges have 5-year backups as it is. So suddenly adding a bunch of new cases on top of that need to be heard urgently, it's just not what they do. And then finally, the State Department, when the State Department processes foreign refugees, they like to go to a place that they think, for them, processing foreign refugees is like going to a camp in Turkey filled with Syrian refugees who have been all vetted by the UN High Commissioner on refugees, and then they vet people and bring them to the United States. That's what they do. What they don't do is go to a country where part of the country is controlled perhaps by gangs, where they have people who have legitimate claims within a population, many of whom don't want to for economic reasons, and process people at embassies. It's just not how the State Department processes asylees. And so for them, dealing in country in Central America is also something that's not comfortable, not something that they see as their mission, and not something that's in any way natural. So that's just sort of, you have this problem that falls in between all of these agencies. But then, okay, so these agencies all don't want to do this, but the job of the White House then is to sort of coordinate across agencies and to force government to do things that maybe it doesn't want to do. So this leads us to the policy process in the Obama administration. And the key dynamic in the Obama administration was that this was run through the National Security Council. And the National Security Council is basically, the National Security Council has had sort of 2 big things happen that have led to more and more things being pushed to the National Security Council and more people being put within the National Security Council. So first, it's a very thorough place. It's designed to prevent mistakes. It is the kind of place where everyone who needs to be involved in a decision is brought into a decision. Coordination is done. There's huge amounts of redundant coordination to make sure that nothing is missed, that there isn't some kind of legal issue or some kind of other kind of problem. It's something that's a very, very thorough and rigorous, and everything is recorded. And it's a very thorough and rigorous process for deciding, for teeing up and making decisions, and then making sure, following up on their implementation. And what that means is, though it's slow, it's very effective. It's something that once a decision is made within the NSC, or once a policy change occurs, that's basically set. You've had all the key people, you've elevated it to the right level, it's done. It's not like some of the other policy councils in the White House, whether it's the National Economic Council or the Domestic Policy Council. They have fewer resources, they might not have as rigorous processes, sometimes decisions get made, but someone else wasn't involved, so then they have to go back. There's all kinds of other things that can occur that could affect how things are, the effectiveness of it. It could affect whether or not these things are really decided and whether things are actually implemented afterwards. But the NSC is an area that is a place that doesn't really have that problem. It's very rigorous. And so the result is that more and more things have been pushed to the NSC, and everyone wants to work at the NSC. And so the consequence of that when I was there is that there were like 5 or 6 deputy national security advisors. It shifted a little bit. But whereas under, in the Scowcroft era, you had Robert Gates was the deputy national security advisor, and he would convene the deputy secretaries for a deputies committee. And now you have 5 people doing that. You had a deputy national security advisor for strategic communications. Maybe in another administration might have just been a speechwriter for the president, but now it's a deputy national security advisor, so it has a series of powers related to that, ability to convene. You have a deputy national security advisor for international economics, which obviously overlaps with things like the National Economic Council, and maybe previously that person might have been in Treasury or whatever. And so the result is you have then a lot of leadership and a lot of people relying on convening at the deputy secretary level to make progress on things and as a way to deal with problems. And so what happened in the Obama administration is that once this crisis ramped up and once the president had given direction, the response was, we'll have a bunch of deputies committees about this. We'll convene the deputies regularly and we will deal with this, and that's how we'll handle the process. And what happened is that these, over time, when you have a meeting like that that's set, if it's decisional, decisions get made and then they go off and be implemented. But if decisions aren't being made, then it starts to just be management by a committee. And this is the NSC is a very effective place to make decisions and sort of enforce them, but it's not a good entity to manage something, to manage a process. And so you had this whole thing being managed by committee. And when you're convening people at that level that frequently, it sort of eliminates the ability of other people to take action and make decisions, because they know that their boss is going to have to go to a meeting the next week and talk about this, and they might get reversed or something else might happen. So everything sort of then centers in this process, but then at the same time, the process isn't very effective for actually managing or dealing with what's happening. And so that's what the dynamic that evolved in the Obama administration. And a lot of this also was because for the administration at the time, the migration priorities were all the executive actions. They wanted to effectively implement and protect DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. They wanted to include parents of childhood arrivals within those executive actions. That was what people saw as their legacy and the key priority at the time. And so that was the focus. And so for this migration from Central America, the challenge was, or the approach was, well, let's fix this so that we can focus on these other more important sort of legacy issues that we'll do through our executive actions. But that didn't leave a lot of great options. You have this in between all the different agencies. You're convening leadership regularly, but we're not really making tough decisions. And so what did they do? And well, what happened and what actually reduced the flows and what actually turned this from a crisis to just sort of maybe an ongoing sort of simmer at something that was coming down the road was the intervention by the government of Mexico. And so the backdrop on this is that the relations between the United States government and government of Mexico in the decade beforehand changed incredibly dramatically, and the level of cooperation on migration and security was really unprecedented. This is something that, even when I started working on this in 2009, and when I arrived, a lot of these mechanisms were relatively new. But there were a whole series of things where there was the Merit, the Merit Initiative, which is in 2007, where there's a large amount of foreign aid coming to the Mexican government for security. In 2010, and this was all driven by the instability in Mexico, by the cartel violence and President Calderon's attempts to sort of take control and address the cartels directly. In 2010, President Calderon and President Obama issued a joint declaration, a declaration on joint border management, which for the first time you had a U.S. president saying that criminal networks are both people and drugs moving north, but guns and money moving south. Addressed by the president, who was saying that for the first time, this is a shared responsibility, that these criminal organizations are not just operating in one country, but have corridors throughout both, and that you need a joint response. Pardon me. So, building on this, suddenly the United States and Mexican governments were able to address things that had never been jointly addressed before, things that had been ongoing sources of irritation between the two governments. And the most dramatic examples are Border Patrol use of force. We were able to establish a group led by the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection and his Mexican counterparts that would meet quarterly and review all of the recent incidents, talk about how to improve, how to avoid these incidents, talk about the status of investigations, or all things like this, stuff that previously had just been just a constant bilateral irritant. I mean, I remember when I was first in one of these sort of huge bilateral meetings, there was a point early on where the Mexican deputy secretary from the foreign ministry got up and started just yelling about the most recent incident where a border patrol agent, was an incident of border patrol use of force. And I sort of turned to a colleague next to me and said, like, oh, this meeting's really going off the rails. And he said, no, Julian does this every time. It's just part of the meeting. And then we, sort of, but we were able to get past that, where it stopped being this sort of like, all right, we're expressing our anger. You're sort of saying, well, we can't tell you because it's an investigation. We're able to work on it. Additionally, there were working groups on repatriation of Mexicans, which again was something that was constantly a source of irritation. When people were allowed to move back and forth, which ports they were dropped off at, whether it was nighttime, whether there were Mexican officials ready to bring them in. All of this, things that had constantly been caught as the problems previously. And then last, we established joint patrols where the Mexican Federal Police and the Border Patrol would actually plan patrols on both sides of the border so that they could go to areas that were highest risk of violence against agents, maybe attacks on agents that could result in the Border Patrol shooting someone, or you'd have staging areas for cartel staging areas for crossing with other narcotics or people in between, where they would plan these out together, which again, Border Patrol and Mexican counterparts sitting down planning operations together was really unprecedented. And what this led to is in 2014, the Mexican government ramped up enforcement ramped up migration enforcement for people transiting Mexico in a way that they'd never done before. They sent 300 people to their southern border. They continued to increase their resources, and the result was within a year or two, Mexico was stopping nearly as many Central American, or sometimes more Central Americans than the United States was at the southwest border, and this dramatically took the pressure off the U.S. southwest border. But really, at the time, it was perceived, in the White House, it was perceived, I think, generally, as Mexico's intervention was the thing that had stopped the crisis for the United States. And so then we come to the Trump administration, and I have the significant caveats that I did not have no experience working directly in this administration. I was a political appointee before. I do have, though, friends and other colleagues who've been through, and I certainly have impressions, which I will share. And this is a little bit glib, but the difference between the policy process and the Obama administration and in the Trump administration on border issues is that in the Obama administration there was a policy process on border issues. What we're seeing now is that there are lots of actors involved who are not necessarily part of any kind of formal policy process. You have people like the head of the Border Patrol's union advising the president directly and speaking with him things. And this is not a person who is a member of, is an executive in the United States government or something. And so you have people being involved in people providing advice and decisions being made outside of the kind of process that used to exist through the National Security Council. And the National Security Council still, of course, exists, but it's not dealing with these kind of issues in the same way, and it has been largely sidelined for these specific issues. And so what happens is that decisions are made much more quickly than they used to be. And look, there were very valid criticisms of the Obama NSC as a talk shop, a place where decisions went to die. But at the same time, these decisions are made quickly, but they're not considered. You haven't gone through the kind of vetting for them that would have been standard before, where you would have worked through legal issues maybe, or where you would have had input on how Congress would react, or good input on how Congress would react, or other operational issues. And so just a few examples. At the beginning of the administration, there were a flurry of executive orders about building the wall, increasing the number of Border Patrol agents, increasing the size of ICE. And there was also a lot of language, or sort of aggressive language about immigration enforcement. And this did have an initial effect of dropping the number of apprehensions. The number of people crossing hit an all-time low in 2017. But it didn't actually change much. The wall didn't get built because of this executive order. It's very difficult to hire more Border Patrol agents. They already previously couldn't hit their statutorily mandated hiring floors. So things didn't actually change. Migrants became aware of that and continued coming. And so now then the numbers of people coming have continued to increase. You see it again with things like zero tolerance, where it was announced that everyone who crosses the border is going to be prosecuted. There was never the capacity to do that. There was never the ability, the prosecutorial ability, the ability to hold people. There's never the ability to actually implement that. And so a month and a half later, they had to announce, like, we couldn't actually do this, and we drew back. You see this even more now with these threats to shut the border, against the government of Mexico. Especially with the current Mexican president, the idea that he's going to respond to a threat to shut the border by being willing to be seen as capitulating to the president of the United States on something like this is just not very likely. It's not likely to succeed, and also shutting the border is just not a good idea economically for the United States, for a lot of other reasons, but specifically economically for the United States. It would really be a devastating thing to do. So you have decisions being made much more quickly, but they're not considered. And this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when you don't have the kind of robust process that you had under the previous National Security Council. And so what that's led to, and the reason that migration is now hitting record levels, and I actually would say this year we're on pace to maybe have 1 million apprehensions at the border. I think this is actually administratively much more burdensome than what the previous high water mark, because in early 2000s, you had 1 million, you had 1.6 million people crossing. Those were a lot of the same individuals crossing multiple times, being removed to Mexico, trying again. These are unique individuals, and every one of them is then entering into, or not every one of them, but the majority of them are entering into they're making claims for humanitarian protections. They're going through the immigration court processes. It's a long process. Many of them will be here for years as they go through the process. And so what's happened is we've created a huge incentive for this that has led to it. First, migrants think that something might change. They think that the president may change the laws, but they're also aware that he hasn't. So that creates a huge incentive for them to come now. Second, the government of Mexico is not interested, in the way it was, with enforcing migration from Central America. So now you don't have the kind of break that the government of Mexico previously applied, again, giving migrants an incentive to go now. Third, you have organizations and other groups that are opposed to the president, that are supportive of migration, that are actually organizing buses and other things to make it easier for people to cross. So now it's cheaper than it used to be. You're much more likely to make it through Mexico, and there's a concern that the laws are going to change in the United States. So if you ever wanted to migrate, you have this very, very urgent reasons to come now. And I think that's why we're seeing the dramatically increased flows that we've seen now. So just to sum up quickly, and then I'd love to take questions and love to talk about this a little bit more with all of you. We have a border that was really built to do something different than what it's doing, and that's stressing the institutions there, and that's being very difficult for the United States government to adapt to. Compounding that, you have a bunch of agencies, a bunch of government entities that aren't organized to do this, but also don't see this as what they do. They are not designed to take mass migration of people claiming humanitarian protections at the southwest border. That's not something that they've built themselves up to do, and not something they're structured for. In the Obama administration, the response to this was largely managing by meetings, and there was a focus on other priorities in terms of migration that meant that difficult decisions or significant changes weren't necessarily made. The government of Mexico was the significant change. Their intervention is what stopped the crisis, or basically reduced it the first time. And then now we see what happens when you don't have the same kind of policy process, and where you've created, really unintentionally, but you've created significant incentives for migrants to come now without a good solution to it, without a good way to actually change this. And that's what I think has led to a lot of the dramatic actions now, where people are sort of looking for something that'll hit the switch and stop this. So with that, I'll stop talking for a second, but I would love to take any questions, and love to talk some more here. We start there. I think your hand was up there.
Very interesting. A couple questions or thoughts. Your take, I think you call it a crisis. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Is there a difference between a crisis and an emergency? Number one. Number two, where does Congress and the court system fit into this right now, where it seems to me it's more political than anything?
Yeah, so I use the term crisis because it seems odd to call something that's been happening for 5 years an emergency, but I think probably both are accurate right now. In terms of Congress, like to me, the solution to any kind of long-term solution to this, and I think we've gotten away from this in a lot of public discussions, comes from reforming our immigration laws. I mean, that is, we can take a rational look at this. We have the ability to change the laws that have created sort of perverse incentives here, and we can. We certainly have the ability to act. Congress has been very reluctant to do that. In terms of the courts, the courts have been the significant brake on a lot of these initiatives that this administration has tried, either through whether things like family separation or other things. And I think they'll continue to be so. I think that the reporting you see about what the president is asking officials to do indicates that a lot of these things, there's significant legal issues with them, and I think we'll just continue to see court challenge after court challenge as they try to, if hypothetically they tried to reinstitute family separation, or if they tried to ignore the Flores ruling or something else, like all of these things would be very, very hard to defend in court. So I think you were next in the back.
So I was curious, given that the U.S. already has a history of reorganizing immigration agencies, do you think that another reorg would be an effective reform for dealing with this core competency issue that you're talking about?
Please repeat the question, please.
Sure. She's asking if the reorganization of the agencies involved would be the answer. I don't know that a reorganization would be involved. The one piece that really stands out is sort of in the wrong place is the immigration courts and the Department of Justice, which apparently was just because when people were like shifting around pieces of construction paper in a White House basement to create the Department of Homeland Security, they just forgot one. I mean, seriously, like that. But I don't know that reorganizing it is going to be the key. I think what you really need to do are change the way you need to sort of change the way these agencies are resourced to do this, and make this something that becomes. They need to recognize that their mission is not what it used to be, and that they need to adapt, and they need to be resourced appropriately to do something different. I don't think you want the Border Patrol, which now is wildly over-resourced to stop just Mexican migrants, doing its thing, and then some other group of people at the border doing intake. What you need is the Border Patrol has a different mission, and they're going to have a different mission for the next 50 years, and they need to adapt to that. I think you might have been next.
Well, what's the primary driver for all the people coming from Central America? Is it just their bad economies there, or is it drugs or gangs, or what's? Because obviously, maybe the economy has not always been this bad in Central America. What's caused it in the last 5-10 years?
So there have been, I think, a number of different factors. The answer is it's a combination of things. There have been very, very high levels of violence, at least at different times over the last 5 years. In 2014, there were really horrifying levels of violence in El Salvador and Honduras, particularly. What we've seen is that a large amount of it is violence, gangs, other things, and then a large or domestic violence or other kinds of really sort of awful situations. But a significant amount of it is also economic opportunity. It's not which shouldn't be belittled as something as a reason to migrate. It's not a traditional asylum category, but it's generally been a mix of those things, and that when you have things like a drought or something, or a failure of a coffee crop, that there will be increases from certain countries. But it's been basically a combination of instability, gangs, violence, other sort of bad conditions in the Northern Triangle countries, and a pervasive lack of economic opportunity. You really can't overstate how much greater the opportunities are for a migrant once they arrive in the United States compared to what a lot of people are facing in the Guatemalan highlands or other places.
One element, of course, complicating the whole picture, including the immigration reform that I agree is critical, is we've always had a strain of nativism and xenophobia, but with the way that social media has exacerbated it in today's discussion, and the number of people who are simply opposed to anybody coming in from the South. How do we address this?
I don't know. Look, I think that there actually are. I think the public discussion about migration is perhaps causing people to think that they disagree more than they might actually do. I think when you talk to a lot of folks, and I was a Democratic political appointee, but I worked with a lot of Republican appointees in the Department of Homeland Security. There are certain things with our migration system that there actually is a lot of consensus, or there can be a lot of consensus around. I mean, we basically have a very bad guest worker program right now in the United States. You come illegally and you can work, and then maybe, as long as you stay away from interacting with authorities, you can probably continue staying, but then who knows, maybe at some point you will interact in a way that could lead you to be ordered removed or something. We have systems right now that are just that aren't good for really anyone involved. Not good for the migrants. Not good for security. Not good for anyone. And so there have been. I mean, there have been bipartisan bills. In 2013, there was a bipartisan Senate bill that could have led to progress. And I believe that there still is a space for it. Obviously, the current administration and that's less likely, but I think that there has been sort of a space for a reasonable consensus before on a lot of immigration issues. Someone over here.
You mentioned that the number of people coming from Mexico into the United States is, in some respects, reversed. I believe a lot of that was caused by NAFTA and the success of NAFTA creating a middle class in Mexico that have good jobs and everything. Should the United States change its position and give more aid to the Central American countries and help them build infrastructure and create jobs and industry down there? And wouldn't that be the best solution to this?
So certainly improving the conditions in the Northern Triangle countries is the long-term solution to people wanting to, they're basically feeling compelled to leave. In terms of USAID, yes, it is important, and significant amounts of aid have been committed. I believe we should, we need to continue that and follow through. I will say though that is a very long-term solution. That is maybe decades from now before the change. From when NAFTA began to when we started to really see reductions in the United States, in migration in the United States was over from 25 years and 25 years. And I think you need to think on a similar scale for the Northern Triangle countries. It's going to take a long time before the economic benefits that they might have from coming to the United States and living in the United States for a long time are equal to something that's just available for many of these locations. Here.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank you for clarifying what I had already suspected and kind of knew of the difference in administrations. And I have lived on both sides of the borders my entire life, and I understand and have lived through the changes that you describe, and that you put very eloquently, by the way. My question is this, and what I have seen throughout the years is that whenever there is cooperation or joint efforts between Mexico and the United States, there is a lot better results, as you have explained. Because the border issue itself, it affects Mexico equally as it does the United States, maybe a bit in different areas, but it is a drastic effect on both sides of the border. And it is an issue that cannot be solved on one side, and that is the question, is do you think it's an issue that can be solved only by the U.S.? And the antagonistic way that the current president or administration is going about accusing Mexico, putting all the blame on Mexico because Mexico is sending us, well, Mexico as the government is sending nothing. Is that is that more detrimental? I realize that he's beating the drum to his base, but is that more detrimental in the long run than beneficial of forming joint relations?
Yeah, so I think, so thanks very much for your kind words and your question. The single thing, the single area in which we could get the most return on investment in border security, in the number of people crossing, in the amount of drugs moving across the border, in the instability and attacks on agents, the single thing that will pay the biggest dividends in preventing and reducing that is an increase in the resources on the Mexican side of the border. That is, we've seen, you cannot just treat the border as just a line where you're waiting on your side and then suddenly something shows up and then you try and figure out what it is. That is not sufficient in this day and age to actually be able to identify what's happening and to actually stop organized criminal organizations that are moving transnationally and are very well resourced. And so, in order to deal with these problems, absolutely, I think that the more the United States government can help the Mexican government, give them resources, help them build capacity and train and assist in this sort of generational shift that they're already going through on their own, the better off we'll be, both in terms of security and economics and everything else. Maybe on this side, go ahead. Sure, go ahead, please.
As a perhaps interim fix while dealing with the issues you just mentioned, what impact do you think a very large increase in immigration courts located in proximity of the border would affect and maybe calm the situation somewhat and make it more orderly?
Sure. I think you need a very large increase in immigration courts. Right now, I think there's something like 300, a little over 300 judges, and it's EOIR. It's pronounced EOR. An organization that provides a lot of bad news. So yes, the immigration courts are a huge backlog and a source of a lot of this instability, because people who have legitimate claims and who may eventually be successful in being granted protections have to wait years to do so, and people who do not can then understand that there'll be years before they have any kind of hearing and don't have to show up in integrated communities, and then 5 years later maybe they get an order of removal and maybe they get removed, and at that point they've got roots in the community, and it's really sort of the worst situation for security, worst situation for the migrants, worst situation for everyone. So yes, adjudicating these cases and doing so in a reasonable and humane and fair way much more quickly is absolutely something that deserves investment. Right?
So your analysis of what has happened in the Obama administration was excellent, and I think right on target as well as currently. When you sort of listen to the story about bureaucracies not agreeing on what their mission should be, about endless decision-making on the one hand, or the Trump administration's, let's just do something even if it's illegal, it all argues, I think, the same issue, and I want your reaction to this is, we don't agree what we want to do. I guess I'm pushing back a little bit about the lack of consensus. What is it we want to achieve? Whether, do we agree with the, and I say we now, do we agree with the asylum law as it is, or don't we? Do we want a more diverse society, or don't we? All these issues, what ends up happening is you policy prescribe around the bias.
Yeah.
So I'd like your reaction to that.
No, that's fair. I mean, you would see this with, there's certainly organizations, there are a lot of organizations that would like to have much higher levels of legal migration. But in the absence of that, they would like Central Americans who are arriving at the border to be able to stay in the United States. So you'll have situations where there are groups that they might prefer another outcome, but who aren't necessarily displeased if people are able to, aren't necessarily displeased if there's sort of a similar effect that comes through. That's a very fair point that we don't necessarily know what we agree on, and I think that's become obviously more the case more recently. But at the same time, I think there should be agreement, or I think there's agreement that this is not a good system. That the way this is being handled is not in the interests of security, not in the interests of the migrants, not in the interests of really anyone. I think one of the things that has been where I think one of the things that has been sort of the hardest to move forward, and where I think there probably could be a lot of agreement, is that right now our border security and enforcement burden falls very much on individual migrants. Right? And migrants are the ones who may get removed, migrants are the ones who are apprehended at the border, and we don't seriously sanction employers in a way that other countries do, and in a way that we could. And if we were to seriously make it much more difficult for, say, contractors in Austin or others, who rely on illegal labor to do so, there are steps that there just hasn't been political will for that would have dramatic results. So that was a fair point, please.
I teach here. I'm a retired CIA guy, and a big part of your presentation was really about government, using this particular piece as an example. Okay, so I just want to make a comment and ask you a question.
Yeah,
see
please.
if you agree with it. So, what a soundbite my students here is that the U.S. government, when we need to knock heads together and come up with a consensus and implement and align what we're doing, is we're limited by the bandwidth of the National Security Council's Deputies Committee. And in 2014, just off the top of my head, I was writing down, you've got Arab Spring, you've got Syria, you've got North Korea, you've got China, and literally manage. So what you were saying, which I completely agree with, and was going to some of those type of meetings, not yours, during that right before that period at least, is we were trying to not just make policy, but we were trying to manage policy from the National Security Council, which was not what it was created to do. And so I think I just exceeded 20 seconds, but I'm going to raise Plan Colombia, okay? Because what I think the people that have been to 1,000 of those meetings, we're trying to tell you who are just discovering how it worked, is the cool thing about Plan Colombia. It's different in terms, all problems are different, is we delegated that to a lead agency. CIA was not the lead agency, DEA was not the lead agency, State Department was the lead agency for Plan Colombia, and they worked out the issues at Maryland and places like that. And then they reported to the NSC what they were doing to manage the problem. And there was sustained resourcing. There was some heads that had to be knocked together and disagreements, but we delegated that off the National Security Council. So if we were going to delegate this problem, and I think you said it's not clear, but if someone asked the question, who would be the lead agency? And if you subordinated everybody to an agency, who would that lead agency be?
Well, okay, so thank you very much.
Yeah.
I
just wanted to do my role there,
you did. That's great. The clear place for this to land, I mean, the place that has more skin in the game than anywhere else is within the Department of Homeland Security. That is the sort of natural place. I think the problem, though, is sort of like the point that you've gotten to, is that a lot of these agencies don't necessarily work well together, and this has been exacerbated now that the Department of Homeland Security has been created. The State Department likes to, when something's happening in Mexico or in any foreign country, the State Department wants to control what's happening and have that go through them, like they did in Colombia. Mexico is different because you have all of these other entities interacting all the time with the Mexican government, and that's a constant source of friction. And so any kind of Mexico issue, anything with migration, State Department wants to run it through the embassy, but then the Department of Homeland Security is having all these meetings at the border they don't tell the State Department about, and everyone's mad at each other. And so it's hard to get these agencies to work together. And so what happens then is that people just use the National Security Council as a crutch. Well, we know we can get everyone to the meeting, we know we can get everyone in, and we can handle this that way. They tried for a little while, actually, with this issue to stand up a FEMA-led coordination group, because FEMA is very good at responding to crisis. They said, all right, we're going to put FEMA in charge, everyone's going to have to go to these meetings, this is how we're going to coordinate unaccompanied children. And what would happen is I'd go to these meetings and people would say, I can't report on what we're doing, this will be revealed at the Deputies Committee next week. And so then you'd be in these terrible meetings where no one would talk about what they were doing because they didn't want to get ahead of their bosses. And anyway, but yeah, the National Security Council is part of the reason it's expanded so much is because it's a crutch for a lot of these things. You can just say, like, well, we'll kick it to the NSC, and then everyone's like, great, something will get done, which isn't necessarily the case. A lot of times they should be making a decision, putting someone in charge, and then holding those people accountable. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Well, just to relate to, and thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. We've been commenting constantly about class here. I'll try to play a little bit of the devil's advocate. You were describing basically your tenure, and you compared it to previous periods, in which the volume of interaction spiked up, and then obviously now we're in a different period of the current administration. My question would be twofold, and it's connected to something which I would term, for lack of better words, as credible commitments beyond Mexico. I want to hear your comments, when you're dealing with foreign governments, because I absolutely agree that it's crucial that you have a partner in order to help. But you were talking about creating reverse incentives. So a little bit about the amount and the quality of interactions, that would help, in your opinion, as of today, to regulate this problem, and the credible commitments. Because frankly, to say it in plain English, if I am a foreign national working for a government, not necessarily the Mexican one, or others that you want to solve a problem with, and I have all kinds of institutional problems, anywhere from petty corruption to state capture, which is not unknown to either the intelligence services or the State Department or so on, you will hear at a meeting from me as a representative of the Department or any other U.S. government agency, anything you want from me to hear, as long as I can get on the hook and get what I need. So the volume of our interactions practically will be, spiking up a lot, except that the delivery side on my side might be problematic. I'll do both. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. So in terms of the quality of interactions, so those are great points. You can interact with foreign governments. A lot of them have really significant internal challenges. And one of the ways this was manifested with the government of Mexico is that the leadership of these agencies kept very, very tight control on how they would interact with the United States, and then who all else would be aware of it. And part of this is because they were comparatively under-resourced, but a lot of it was from different kind of corruption or other kinds of concerns within a lot of these organizations. And so you'd have a situation where there'd be, the U.S. government has this habit of sort of like hugging to death interlocutors it likes, and so there'd be situations where there'd be someone we really liked at PGR, Mexico's Attorney General Office, and then suddenly everyone is talking about how they're going to call that person. You have 5 assistant secretaries on the U.S. side are like, oh, I'm going to call Baz today. It's what they do. And you could really overwhelm a lot of these people, and you'd have these situations where then it would be harder to follow up. And so that's something that the United States government is honestly not always sensitive to, and it's been a little bit exacerbated by the fact that you have suddenly this whole new department that has lots of people who all want to go and interact with counterparts. And so, the Department of Homeland Security, before people might be with state and justice, and that was it. Justice was the voice of law enforcement, then be the state, and then maybe some of the intel agencies or the defense stuff was sort of siloed. But now, you'll have the Secretary of Homeland Security convening the Northern Triangle, foreign ministers or something, or you have interior ministers, and they have all of these other interactions that they used to have. And I think overall this is a good thing. I think what the highest quality interactions are when you have counterparts from countries that need to work together a lot interacting correctly, whether it's the Commissioner of Customs or the heads of the intel agencies. I mean, these are people who just should be interacting together a lot, especially the U.S. and Mexico. And the more you can enable that kind of stuff, the better. Doing that without creating these sort of terrible day-long meetings where everyone sits in these giant rooms and gives these canned presentations is difficult. But the more you can establish those kind of direct relationships, like that's where the real work gets done and a lot of the progress happens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, tell us about the West Wing. Did you ever have the questions at your committee meetings? If you want cheap Chinese food, if you want your grapes picked, you better let labor in. And that's immigrants and undocumented immigrants. Did it ever come up?
So, in the meetings that I was in the White House, they weren't. So, I dealt a lot with comprehensive immigration reform before I worked in the White House. I was the lead in the commissioner's office in and Customs and Border Protection in 2013 when all those bills were up. And so, we were just constantly getting these different drafts of bills and then trying to figure out what they meant, and we had to cost things out all the time, and that was a pretty terrible process. But, that there is an understanding, I think, or at least an understanding among a lot of the people who are doing immigration policy seriously, that there are just certain industries in the United States that are basically dependent right now on undocumented labor. Whether it's agriculture or whether hotels, whether it's construction. These are there are a lot of either childcare or other things. These are things that are just like housekeeping. These are things that are it's just built in to the business models, restaurants. And there are pretty clear ways where you could rationalize a system where people are either brought in as guest workers or where you would put the enforcement burden on these industries, which would raise a lot of prices, but at the same time would actually deal with this in a serious way where we show that we care about what our laws mean and we want them to be rational and we have certain we're making certain decisions based on that. So, but anyway, to answer your question, the meetings I was all in were all much more technical and specific. We weren't generally talking about future immigration law. I'm sure that there were people having those meetings, but it wasn't me.
Yeah. Under the Obama administration, in terms of dealing and understanding the immigration problem, how much interaction was done with the actual immigrant families as opposed to seeing them as a number and actually understanding why they cross or why they're here, why they do it illegally and not legally, which is, I feel like it's a question that a lot of the country asks themselves, why, if there's a process, why do you go through it? But, I mean, being raised on the Mexican-American border, I have a lot of families and a lot of family members who are immigrants and a lot of friends that are also immigrants. So I feel like asking why don't you do it legally is a stupid question. So how much interaction was done with actual immigrants as opposed to seeing them as a statistic and a number?
Sure. So I know that's a good question. There were, especially in the domestic policy council, there were a large number of very senior people who were immigrants themselves. But at the time, we put an enormous amount of effort into understanding why people were migrating. I mean, that was something that was really a top priority, and whether that was with interviews with migrants themselves, or there's this whole long process where Health and Human Services went through and talked to a lot of the unaccompanied children who'd arrived, sort of heard their stories, and then they would remove personally identifying information, but we'd get 150 pages of every child's story that they've been able to talk to as they go through. And then there were a whole series of other things we would do to try to understand in country people who wanted to migrate, why you wanted to migrate, what are the reasons, what is your understanding of U.S. immigration law, why are people coming now? I mean, that was sort of the key question at the time, is like why now? The laws that people were using had been in place since 2008. Why in 2014? Has it been such an economic shift, or had there been something else? Like what was driving that? A lot of the answers were a mix of things. It was not like this one thing happened and then everyone did it, but we did put a lot of effort into trying to understand what was driving all of that. At the same time, though, our responsibility, what we're trying to do is, we're making policy decisions about what these organizations, what the different parts of government are doing, and trying to tee up those decisions in ways that make sense. So, for people who were involved in the policy process, it was nice to be able to do outreach. It was nice to be able to travel. A lot of people went to the different places where families were being detained at the time, whether it's Hutto or other of these facilities on the border. But that's the kind of thing that is always difficult to do when you're in a White House, because you're swamped all the time. You have this sort of daily grind, and there's a Deputies Committee in 2 weeks. You're not able to do kind of information gathering, and you're sort of relying on a lot of the agencies that do interact with people all the time to provide that information, to put that into the process. And there.
So we're running low on time. We can take a few more questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, basically, so considering all of the problems you've outlined, to what extent does the proposed border wall fail to address a lot of these? And also, we've kind of touched on long-term and short-term solutions, like Mexican enforcement is more of a short term, congressional reform is more of a long term. Can you outline what you see as those are? And lastly, what statistics and kind of rhetoric is often thrown out that confuses people about the reality of what you thought?
Sure, I'll just be sort of quick. The border wall is not relevant to this problem. The border wall is something, the ability of people to cross to enter the United States and then claim asylum. First, there is almost no situation where you could really put a 30-foot wall over the entire border. If you were able to do that, it would take 20 years to do. It's just not a feasible thing. Even if you did, there are areas that are mountainous enough where you wouldn't be able to put a wall. If someone really wanted to get across and step in the U.S. and claim asylum, they could do it. But even if you were able to just seal the entire border, what we've seen is that people adapt and people will find other ways to get to a place where they can claim asylum. We saw this with Cuban migrants. There used to be this policy called wet foot, dry foot, where if a Cuban arrived in Miami or arrived in Florida, they were allowed to claim protections under the Cuban Adjustment Act. If they were caught at sea, they were returned to Cuba, and this policy was in place, and suddenly Cubans start flying into Mexico and then walking to the border in Laredo, where they're like, dry foot, we're here, and suddenly they get to go through the same process. And these things, people will. You can't be too clever with solutions to these sort of things. You need a rational. You need actually a rational response and solution. You're saying, well, we'll just build a wall, and then none of these people. You need to remove the incentives or fix the incentives so that you're allowing people who need protections to come to the United States and other people not to in order to deal with that. In terms of the rhetoric and statistics, I find a lot of the discussion about this to be very, very separated from a lot of the issues that I worked on and a lot of the sort of decisions that we would deal with. The discussion of whether or not there should be a wall, whether there should be the military at the border. The problem right now is not apprehending people. People are turning themselves into the government and asking to be apprehended. So it's just not, a lot of the public discussion is not related to that. And the same thing on the other side. I particularly have been vocal about the abolish ICE music movement and how I don't think that's a good idea. And I think what's happened is that there have been a lot of very sort of emotional issues that have come in the way of the need that exists to reform our immigration laws, and that a lot of the challenges that a lot of the problems that people are identifying would be fixed by rationalizing and fixing our immigration laws, and that the legal status is the way to protect people who you don't want to have removed from the United States. So, to answer your question, maybe one right here. Yeah.
By implementing these metering processes at the ports of entry and denying people the ability to claim asylum there and forcing them to cross irregularly, could you make the argument that the administration is in fact exacerbating the problem? And like you mentioned, Border Patrol is not trained or equipped to be processing people that way. Obviously, the CBP at the ports of entry are more equipped to do so, maybe not in these sorts of numbers, but more so than Border Patrol. And if so, do you think that is being done on purpose to kind of artificially inflate apprehension numbers to create the perception of a crisis at the border?
So I'll answer the last part first. I don't think it's being done for that reason, just because I don't, it was done to some extent before this administration. I think what the metering is basically the result of, ports of entry are not designed to intake large amounts of asylum seekers. They're designed, well, they were designed 40 years ago in many situations, but they're designed to process legitimate traffic and then remove a few people or a few vehicles to be, a vehicle gets torn apart, a person gets interviewed. Like that's what they're set up to do. They're not designed to have a person come in for a half day of discussions with a Citizenship and Immigration Services officer or someone to, that's just not what they're built for. And so I think the reason that CBP is instituting this is because they feel overwhelmed. They don't know how to deal with it at the ports, and they're just trying to come up with some solution or way to deal with it. I obviously don't think metering is a very good one. But you're right that this creates a huge incentive for people to cross in between the ports, because then they're part of the system, right? Then at least you're making your declaration, you're on United States soil, and you get to go through the process. So this just goes back to, if we want, as a country, if we want large numbers of Central Americans to be able to make asylum claims and then we want to adjudicate them, we can come up with much better ways to do that. You know, we could just fly 100,000 people from any of the Northern Triangle countries to the United States and go through a process there. We don't have to have them come across the border and do this. We could do in country. We could wildly expand the processing that we're doing in country. There are rational ways we could achieve these ends, but we have to sort of recognize what's happening and take it seriously. Whereas if we're just saying we're going to build a wall or other things like that, you know, that's not addressing what's actually happening and coming up with solutions for it.
Great, well, thank you so much for this really wide-ranging conversation, and please join me in thanking them.